Next we have Bill Broyles, who's an old friend of Alexander also, a screenwriter, a novelist, and the editor of the Texas Monthly, right?
Thanks very much. One of the things I'd like to do is, obviously, Alexander didn't spring fully formed with an Underwood 10 from the head of Zeus. He had such a strong family background, and his parents made such a powerful impression on me. I want to just talk a little bit about that and then go on to something else, which was in the spring of 1967, Andrew and I, can you hear me okay? Spring of 67, Andrew and I took a trip in a Tim's laundry van I bought for 10 quid up through the lake country to go visit Claude and Patricia at Brook Lodge. We were going to take the ferry and come down through Ireland. The only problem was, since we're talking about car journeys, this Tim's laundry van only had a fourth gear, which meant all through the lake country, Andrew and I were having to push the van up to the top of the hill, then run to catch and jump back in the van to go down, up and down, all across England, across the ferry, down through Ireland, where it finally died about 30 miles from Youghal. We pushed it into a field, abandoned it, caught a bus, and then took a cab up to Brook Lodge. Brook Lodge, I guess about 30 acres, an ancient house that was the kitchen, a Georgian house that had been grafted on it, a barn, a walled garden, horses, sheep, dogs, cats, chickens, ducks, a stream, and one time I went a pot-bellied pig, which had the run of the first floor. We would go, and in the interminable period between tea and cocktails, which was about 30 minutes, I think, and then we would sit, and Claude and Patricia would sit in these easy chairs, and Alexander was there, and Andrew was in and out. He was going to Turkey. And Alexander at the time, let me tell you how he described himself. AC in 1966. Long velour coat, chiffon scarf, Barcelino hat, and of course he left out the blue sunglasses, the Gauloise, and usually he had a copy of the New Left Review under his arm. They would sit and have these most amazing conversations, tell these incredible stories, and they were all smoking at the time, and each of them smoked a different cigarette. So I would be sitting between them and the fire. Whenever they would punctuate their stories, they would flick the cigarette butt into the fireplace. And so I'd be sitting there and like, Gauloise, Woodbine, Players, feeling like I was at the Battle of Stalingrad. And every now and then I would venture some totally callow, stupid remark like democracy, health, and Alexander would say, brilliantly put. And put it in the context of political thought from Marx to Bukharin and make me feel like I was so smart and so welcome. And that generosity of spirit is one of the great things for anyone who's close to any of the Cockburns, you know, is really there. The other thing I want to say is we all kind of understand that Alexander's incredible facility with words, which flowed out of him. Some of us write what we think. We think and then we write it. Some of us write to find out what we think, but Alexander thought and wrote at the same time. He was one with the thinking and the writing. And that passion, that commitment, clearly comes from Claude. But what most of you may not appreciate is what comes from Patricia. When Claude and Patricia met, Patricia had already gone across Canada. She'd made a language map of Africa. She'd been a prisoner in a Ruthenian jail. And at Brook Lodge, she was the one that tended the garden. She was the one who bred the horses. She was the one who could discuss anything from horticulture to grafting roses. Her big project at the time was to create a green rose, which everyone said, all the experts said was impossible. But Patricia had kept these detailed little books and journals about each attempt to graft a rose. She knew everything about it. One day someone was at the place and said, I'm going down to the market to buy clams. She said, clams? You don't buy clams. Here's a shovel and a pail. You go dig clams. Now, does any of this sound familiar? Yeah. Like anyone we know? In Alexander and in Patrick and in Andrew and the subsequent generations, these two inspirations really flow on. And me, who felt like they were my surrogate parents, and Alexander was like the older brother I never had, I felt so powerfully attached to this. It's all really hard. I started Texas Monthly the same year Alexander started doing press clips in the Village Voice. And if you weren't there, it's impossible to appreciate the impact that those weekly columns had on American journalism and politics. No one had ever done anything like it. It was must reading, the same way the Week was must reading in the 1930s. And shortly thereafter, while Alexander was still writing it, I became editor of Newsweek, and I thought, he kept saying, you should have a little of this in there. You should show some courage. You've got this platform. So we ran a couple of columns, articles about American journalism. We wrote one critical article about William F. Buckley. We wrote one about a certain editor at the Times, New York Times, who was using his post to reward and puff up his friends. It turns out both these people were very close friends of Abe Rosenthal, who was the managing editor of the New York Times. And he was incensed. And he invited me over to the Times, and I went by myself. And he gave me this very gracious tour. Here are all the editors. Here's where we do this. Here's where all the people sit. And then we went into the private dining room, and it was a scene straight out of The Exorcist. His head rotated around. His eyes bulged. He just spitting. He said, how could you do such a thing? How could you write this? How could you do this? Just foaming. He said, who do you think you are? Alexander Cockburn? It was the nicest thing anyone ever said about me. In the 70s, a man named Arthur Temple, who was a lumberman from Texas, merged his company with Time Inc., and he became the largest shareholder in Time. And Alexander called said, why don't we go interview said Arthur Temple? So he came down, and this was the 70s. He had on his bell bottoms. He had his sort of shirt unbuttoned to here. He just looked like Alexander. And we were going into East Texas, and the people we were going to meet and go through made those guys in Deliverance look like the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson. And so I said, Alexander, you can go anywhere in Texas so long as you wear a cowboy hat. And we all know Alexander's feelings about hats. So we went into this Stetson store, and I was going to explain things to him, but of course Alexander went on to give me the entire history of the hat, starting with Arab headgear, Mexican sombreros, and then he brought out a Stetson. He would discuss with the man whether he wanted a West Texas crimp or kind of Tom Mix mushroom, and High Plains roll in it. And they talked for like 2 hours about what he was going to do, and they steamed it. They got it just right. Alexander, it has to be just so. He put on this cowboy hat. We went up through East Texas, sawmills and guys, in flatbed trucks. We went into Arthur Temple's office. It was one of those days where like sawdust was going through the sun, and we had this very nice interview, and Alexander had his cowboy hat on. In those days, he carried a big pile of change, so he could stop at a payphone and phone in his story, which he then dictated this amazingly brilliant story at the top of his head. I mean, incredible. And we went back to my house. I got a phone call from Arthur Temple. He said, that guy you brought to interview me, those were the best questions I've ever been asked. Best interview I ever had. But tell me, where did he get that hat? And the guy who was running the Stetson dealer had huge sales of that exactly. People were calling, I want that hat that English guy got. The third little story I wanted to say was, Alexander was always at his best when things went wrong. One time I was visiting at 333 Central Park West, and he spent 2 days cooking this Moroccan chicken, and it was perfectly done. He was lecturing me on every spice and how it was all going to work, and we transferred it into Andrew and Leslie's stove, because they were living in the building too. And he had everybody go sit down, and he and I went in to pull out this amazing chicken, and of course it fell immediately on the floor. And he looked for a second and he said, and I forgot to tell you, the way we finish this is we drag it across the floor before we serve it. Which he did with a big smile. It's been, and also this sense of hope in Alexander. He was born 2 weeks before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, which is one of the darkest times in the history of the 20th century. And I've always thought of this darkness, and then Alexander is this hope and joy in the darkness, which he was. And, he would always say, get up greet each day with unbridled optimism, or be of good cheer, or between the crisis and the catastrophe, you might as well have a glass of champagne. Since Claude Cockburn started working in journalism in the 20s to now, there have been 10 decades of Cockburns, 10 decades of writing amazing things and battling against cant, abuse of power, fighting for justice with righteous indignation and wit. It's going to continue on, Alexander and Patrick. Charlie had his first articles in the Irish Times just this summer. Declan, we were already training in the art of journalism. And I'm just so honored to be here. And I remember I was in Vietnam in 1969, and Alexander sent me a letter that said, it was addressed, dear puppet, soldier, Yankee, imperialist, dog. I've just had a daughter, and a few years later I came back and we gave a party for Daisy, a birthday party. I'm not even sure it was her birthday, but Alexander just worked on it so hard. Everything had to be just right, and we sang, and I watched him look at Daisy, and he had such pride. And it was the same way that Claude and Patricia would look at Alexander and Andrew when they were talking. Just this joy and pride in who they were. So, who do I think I am, Alexander Cockburn? I wish I was. And I think we need him more now than we ever have. And everyone in his family is carrying on a piece of him, and I think we all can too. Thank you.